Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Reynard Burns. I am the Public Relations Officer for the Claude B. Govan Tri-State Chapter of Tuskegee Airmen. It is a metropolitan area chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen. There are 50 chapters in the United States. The 50 does not correspond to the number of states. There are some states that have more than one, but there are 50 Tuskegee Airmen chapters. The chapters became incorporated in 1972, and that's when they started to band together, and they had their first national convention in 1973. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about a quick history of the Tuskegee Airmen, how they started, the things they were up against, and their accomplishments. Along with me is Mr. Paul Berger.
Good evening, everyone.
Mr. Paul Berger is one of the torchbearers for our chapter. In 1925, the Army War College came out with a statement that led the way for so many things that were against blacks in the military. Their statement was, blacks lack the intelligence, the coordination, the fortitude, the perseverance to be real fighters. They were not able to fly an aircraft. They didn't have the coordination, the mechanical skills to repair an aircraft. They were unfit to do anything other than serve in the kitchen or drive service vehicles. Their brain was not the same size, and they were definitely inferior to any other race on the planet. This is something that permeated the military right through and including 1938, 39, 40, 41, which is why there was such a struggle for these Tuskegee Airmen to finally get into the air. In 1938, the civilian pilot training program was started, and the reason for that was to have more private pilots available that could be later used in the military. There were several colleges and institutions selected to have this program. Among them were several black colleges. Tuskegee Institute was one of them. In 1940, the Selective Service Act went into effect. It's the first peacetime draft in the United States history. And one of the parts of that act was that anyone, regardless of race or color, would have the opportunity to volunteer to be inducted. That was the beginning of opening the door for black servicemen to move up the ladder. In 1940, the same year, the War College decided to create a program to develop, and I quote, colored personnel for aviation training. And Tuskegee was selected as one of those sites in 1941. Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, was very influential in convincing the general public that that statement that blacks could not fight, didn't have the aptitude or the skills to pilot the plane, her goal was to disprove that. She went to Tuskegee, which had already been designated as a place to train these black pilots. They had one airfield that was operational, that was Kennedy Field. Another field, Moulton Field, was still under construction. She went there with the intent of trying to raise funds to have this other field completed. She insisted that the chief pilot trainer take her up for a flight in the aircraft. Charles Abramson, I believe it was.
That was Jim.
Yes. Took her up in a flight, much against the wishes of her Secret Service personnel. She came back and made sure that a picture was taken of her and this pilot trainer that she can take back to Washington and prove that black pilots were possible.
What do we think, buddy?
In 1943, the Tuskegee Airmen went into combat. Prior to that, one of their commanders was Benjamin O. Davis. Benjamin O. Davis was a graduate of West Point. His experience at West Point was much different than the other cadets at West Point. During his 4 years there, he was not spoken to, he ate alone, he slept alone, and he was not engaged with anyone else at West Point other than in class. They shunned him because they didn't want him to succeed. He endured the 4 years alone, other than in class time, and became the leader, commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. When they arrived in Tunisia, which was their first combat mission, they were very successful, and soon they joined other fighter squadrons, protecting our troops at Anzio. While there, they downed more German fighters than any of their other squadrons that were there, in spite of the fact that the planes they were flying, which were the P-40, were grossly inferior to the German planes. Mr. Berger.
If I might just roll back the clock just a little bit to the air war once Pearl Harbor took place. Pearl Harbor, as we all know, 1941. And almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. Russia declared war on the United States. Italy declared war on the United States. And the United States, as Ray alluded to, was grossly undermanned, produced. We weren't ready for war, not even close. Our men were being trained with broomsticks at the time. That's how bad it was. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff knew that the only way to stop the German onslaught was with high altitude precision bombing. They knew we couldn't go after them on the field of battle with tanks. We didn't have enough tanks. They knew we couldn't go after them with our ships. Didn't have enough ships. Remember, we lost most of our fleet at Pearl Harbor. Couldn't go after them with manpower. Manpower wasn't trained. But we had an Army Air Force, and we had what the Joint Chiefs of Staff thought was the ultimate air weapon, the Boeing Flying Fortress. This particular aircraft bristled with armament, and the popular thinking was we put enough of these planes in the air, we fly them in a box formation, and we create kill zones. Enemy aircraft coming even close would be destroyed. So we don't have to send them up with anything else but their own guts. Except that the Germans knew better. The Germans knew what a range of a 50 caliber machine gun was. That's what the B-17 was built around. The Germans, flying the Me-109, used 20 millimeter cannon, which had a much greater range. And I have been fortunate in my life to meet a number of people that flew for the United States, and one particular man that flew for the Luftwaffe in Germany. And he'd say, Paul, this is what happened. When we saw the bomber formations, we simply stepped back out of their range and poured in 20 millimeter cannon rounds. First thing we did was take out the gun positions. The bombers were then helpless. Then we came in at all kinds of levels after the wings, which were full of high-octane aviation gasoline. The losses were extraordinary. Anywhere between 60 and 80 aircraft a day. And that's the 8th Air Force only. And these are white fellas flying these aircraft. This is why this story is so compelling. Because at the end of it, it's the black brothers helping to protect their white brothers. And there was a unity that was formed that ultimately was never broken. But let's go back to where it was. 60 to 80 aircraft a day, that's 800 men a day lost. It got so bad that the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, we may have to suspend daylight bombing. Now, I'm a Jew, and I happen to be a white Jew. We now know that had daylight bombing been suspended, Hitler was this close to developing the atom bomb. None of us me first, but nobody else would be here either, had these white guys not kept up that onslaught. But they couldn't keep it up forever because they had no protection. The only aircraft, as my co-gentleman mentioned, that was available was the P-40 Warhawk, which distinguished itself in Anzio, but it was an interceptor aircraft. It was not a long-range aircraft. But even with this aircraft, when the Tuskegee Airmen got their hands on it, they showed what they could do. So Benjamin Davis, as Ray mentioned, went to Washington and he said, I want our men sent to Europe. I want our men given the chance to protect the bombers. And when they got there, the first aircraft that they were given, besides this piece of machine, was the P-47 Thunderbolt. There weren't Red Tails quite yet. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was the first long-range aircraft that the Tuskegee Airmen had. And Mr. Davis, Colonel Davis, said to his crews, you are not pursuit pilots. You are fighter pilots. You will fly wing to wing with the bombers, and you will only engage the German fighter aircraft when you are engaged. And this is not to take anything away from the white pilots who flew at much higher altitudes in what they called CAP, Combat Air Patrol. Okay, because clearly they pulled a great many of the German fighters away from the bomber groups. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the state of the air war in 1942 and the years that followed. Greg?
Paul mentioned about the P-51s and the Red Tails. The Tuskegee Airmen were not known as the Red Tails until they took up that particular plane and decided to paint their tails red to distinguish them from the other squadrons that were guarding the B-17s. B-17s came to know them as the Red Tails, and they began to request them. Rascal Brown, who was one of the captains and commanders of the Tuskegee squadrons, changed the name on his plane by request, because the B-17 pilots began to request the Red Tails as escorts, because they knew they would not leave them. They would stay with them no matter what. It's a controversy right now whether we're sure that they did lose any bombers at all when accompanying them, or they lost fewer. That is up for debate. We just know that B-17 carnage went significantly down when the Red Tails were protecting them. While these Red Tails were guarding these B-17 bombers, there was another unit connected with the Tuskegee Airmen. Most people don't know that they also had a bomber unit, the 477, which was put together in 1944. And the black pilots that graduated from Tuskegee with twin-engine licenses became the pilots and gunnery crews and mechanics and so on for these B-25. They trained, and they were ready to go. They did not make it into World War II. But something happened with them that changed the course of military history. In Freeman Field, the commander of that field was extremely prejudiced. He decided he was going to ignore a law of the military that he could not discriminate on his base. When they were transferred to his field, he decided he was going to have two officer clubs, one for the blacks and one for the whites, which was dead set against regulations. The Tuskegee Airmen got wind of this, and they decided, we're not going to let this happen. 16 of them tried to get into the white officer club. They were stopped, arrested, and confined to quarters. Shortly thereafter, 3 more decided to try and get in. Accidentally, one of them brushed against an officer in the way, and they were all arrested and put behind bars. The commander of this base decided that he was going to create 2 officer clubs. They were going to have one be for trainees, which would be the Tuskegee Airmen, and one for the white officers. And he wanted everybody on the base to sign it, that they accepted it. 100 Tuskegee Airmen refused to sign. He put them all together and said, "You're disobeying an order. The penalty for disobeying order would be imprisonment or possibly death." They refused to sign. They were all arrested and confined. If it weren't for the efforts of the NAACP, some of the lawmakers in Washington, and other social groups, they would have been in jail. They were released shortly thereafter, except for the original 3. After a short time, 2 of those 3 were acquitted, but the 3rd was dishonorably discharged and removed. It wasn't until 1995 that his records were cleared and it was removed. It took that long to get it cleared. So the significance of this, they called it the Freeman Field Mutiny. It was this that started the desegregation of the military. They refused to be excluded from the officers' club. One of the things that the Tuskegee Airmen disliked is when they earned their wings, they became officers. It was understood that white enlisted men did not have to salute a black officer, and that was acceptable. It stayed that way for quite a while. So while we had pursuit pilots, fighter pilots, fighting for freedom overseas, we had others here fighting for freedom in the United States, which made a significant difference and contributed to the desegregation of the armed forces 7 years later.
We had one particular event that I want to bring to everybody's attention. In 1945, the bomber groups received their first orders to actually bomb Berlin. They had never been to Berlin before. And the Tuskegee Airmen got word that they, in fact, would be participating in that particular raid. Unfortunately, while they had the aircraft, they simply did not have enough gas tanks to make the run. One of our very, very now departed Tuskegee Airmen was involved in what I'd like to call, what are we calling it, Ray?
The Great Train Robbery.
The Great Gasoline Tank Train Robbery. The way the story goes, and again, please understand, everything I am telling you I got from 1 or 2 of these great men, and later on the women who loved them. They heard that there were a number of gas tanks, similar to the one that you see on the bottom of this wing, on a railroad siding, which was available but not available because theoretically they had no requisition to get a hold of these tanks. Well, the way the story goes, by the morning of the raid, all the P-51s that were supposed to engage the enemy suddenly had the gas tanks. And we affectionately call it the Great Gas Tank Robbery. What I want to bring out with this, before we talk about just a little bit about the actual air action itself, because it was probably one of the more dramatic episodes of the war. The men who flew these aircraft always felt that they could not stay in the air without the folks on the ground. They never took credit for anything else other than being pilots. They knew that the guys who drove the ambulances, the guys that manned the towers, the guys that were the mechanics, they felt they kept them in the air. And again, I don't make these stories up. I've been privileged in my life to know a number of these great men. And to to a man, they all feel the same way. So now, the stage is set for the first heavy bomber attack on Berlin. The white fighter pilots had their orders. The Tuskegee Airmen had their orders, except that at that particular junction, the white fighter pilots could not be found. Not because they didn't want to be found, they simply did not make the rendezvous in time. And it was the Tuskegee Airmen that escorted the bombers in to Berlin. And for the very first time, the Tuskegee Airmen were faced with this. The German Me-262, a jet fighter aircraft with a speed capability almost 120 miles faster than the best Mustang could ever offer. Now, I was, once again, privileged in my life to know a very wonderful gentleman, and Ray talked to you about him very, very briefly, or his name, Rascal Brown. When I first met Rascal, I had heard about the fact that he was there, and he actually brought down not one but two of these jet fighters with his aircraft. And as a teacher, and that's the way I see myself, I said to Rascal, could you please tell me how you did it? I just want to know how you handled it. I thought he was as pompous as all get out because of the explanation that he gave me. He said, well, Paul, it was quite simple. I looked up and I saw their white vapor trail, and as they passed by, I looked up, I went bum, 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 and they came down. But later I found out that Rascal had the biggest heart that you could ever find. The same big heart that all of the guys that flew these things had. He didn't want individual notoriety. Didn't want it at all. He would say to me over and over and over again, Paul, if it wasn't for those guys on the ground, I never could have done what I did. I never could have prevailed. So I said, okay, Rascal, tell me what you did do so I can tell the people. It was a true, incredible act of flying. So let me demonstrate for you. Here's the B-17, and here's Rascal's aircraft. So close that he could smile at the folks that were piloting the aircraft. Yes, he looked up and recognized the vapor trail of the jets. But remember, he was flying in formation. There were bombers all around him. This is the way he did it. As the Me-262s passed over him at more than 520 miles an hour, he went vertical and fired two bursts. And I still, to this day, I can't imagine how he managed missing his own people. And he brought them down. Just an incredible, incredible, incredible feat of flying. But once again, the knowledge that he was not acting alone, that he was acting as part of a team, that's what prevailed. That's what kept them going. And after the war was over, and as time went on, when I worked with these people, and again, I've been privileged in my life to work with them in various schools. Do you know the message that they give the school kids? Stay in school. Love your country. Love your God. You could be anything that you want to be. And thankfully, many of them saw a black president. So I thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Rick.
The B-17 pilots knew little about the Red Tails other than that they were great escorts. One of the B-17s was damaged as returned on one of their missions, and they were forced to land at Ramitelli, which is where the Tuskegee Airmen were based. Ramitelli was completely manned by blacks. That would be support personnel, mechanics, pilots, kitchen, service personnel. So they were in their own world. And they enjoyed just being themselves, comrades together. This B-17 landed, and when they disembarked from the plane, they looked around and said, "You're the Red Tails." "Yes, we are." And they were amazed to find out that these pilots who had been protecting the bombers were in fact blacks. So they changed their whole outlook on many things. When the Tuskegee Airmen returned after the war, they disembarked, and this is from Rascal Brown himself, said, "When we disembarked and got off of those ships, we had traveled all back together. There was no distinction on who was who, they all traveled back together. Didn't matter what color they were war comrades." But when they disembarked, all the white troops were directed to go one way. They had a band, they had a parade, they had confetti. The black troops were directed down another way. Said, "We got 2 saxophones and a welcome back." And that was it. So nothing changed when they came back. They were still the same discriminated against people, regardless of the fact that they had been at war fighting for freedom overseas, and they still had to come back and try and do it again. Their determination to carry on and exceed expectations continued. They were not allowed to be commercial pilots. They were not allowed to take certain offices. They wouldn't be in legislatures. The only thing they could do was what they could do before, was work in the post office or work for the railroad. They went there and exceeded. One of Mr. DeFore became, at the post office, one of the people on that team that developed the express mail. Alton Burton came and became a civil engineer and helped and led the whole team of engineers in constructing the Twin Towers and the complex at Roosevelt Island. And it's my understanding he was the one that developed that implosion process where instead of a building collapsing this way, it would implode upon itself, which was instituted at the World Trade Center. Imagine if that had not been used, the damage that would have been done. So these men came back home, and in spite of the obstructions that were put in front of them, they continued to climb and force themselves into society and make a name for themselves. And as Mr. Berger said, their goal and their mission was, and continues to be, educate the young, continue your education, be somebody. Don't let anybody step in your way, maintain your goal, and there is no obstruction you cannot overcome. In 1946, the Tuskegee Airmen became the Tuskegee Experience. That encompassed anyone that was still trained in Tuskegee. Tuskegee was disbanded in 1949 when their unit became integrated with the rest of the Air Force. The Air Force, as Paul mentioned, there was no Air Force in World War II, the Army Air Corps. The Air Force did not come into existence until, what year was that? 1948. The military was, I want to say, it's commonly known as desegregated, but the wording actually was, and this was President Truman.
Yes.
Said that, I remember about it, but that it was an equal opportunity. There would be no military sections that would discriminate or prevent anyone from participating to the fullest, which led to the desegregation of the military. Until that time, there were still separate units. The Air Force was the leader in this. The Army and the Navy followed suit. They didn't like it. but they followed suit. And eventually the military had equal opportunity for anyone, for any branch of the service, serving in any capacity. This is the big impact of the Tuskegee Airmen, because in changing the military, they also helped change society itself, because the military had so much of an impact on the rest of society. In the Korean War, that's the first war that the United States participated in, where they were integrated units. That is the first time it happened. It took a while, but this all started with the Tuskegee Airmen. Mr. Berger.
I think I have to make one more correction in my own statement. I believe that the Air Force was called the Air Force before the end of World War II, so I apologize for that, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm going to give you some information that Mrs. Berger and I are privy to, only because we knew some things of Tuskegee Airmen. He had the pleasure of knowing some, I had the pleasure of knowing some before they passed away. The chapter we were in, when I started, had 10 or 11 actual airmen. They were extremely witty, they were very funny, and even though they were in their 80s and 90s, most of them in their 90s plus, they still had the ability to stay on task. They had the ability to stay highly focused. They would joke around, they play, and they were just as any other happy person. Physically, they may not be able to move as well as they used to, but their mind was as sharp as a tack, and that's the thing that impressed me the most. That they could communicate no matter what the situation was. When there was a task or a project they were beginning to approach, they would zero in on that project, on how to address it in the blink of an eye. And their perseverance and their dedication was very evident. And that's one of the reasons why I stayed with the Tuskegee Airmen as their public relations officer. I learned something new about them every day. I learned so much more even in preparation for tonight's event. Everything we read, everything we learn is something new. I didn't have that kind of education because it wasn't around when I was in school. But thankfully it is now, and I support that message. One of our airmen just passed away a few weeks ago, Mr. Bill Johnson. He was a resident of Glen Cove. He was in the class of 45I, which was the second to last graduating class. He never graduated. The war ended before they finished their training. At the end of the war, his class was given the choice to continue and finish their training and graduate and earn their wings. He decided he had had enough of the segregation and the discrimination. He decided, I'm going to return home. This was my life. I always wanted to be an airman. I always wanted to be a pilot, but I just couldn't take it anymore. Many of the airmen were from urban areas, the New York metropolitan area and other major cities around the country. Many of them were from the north. In their travel to Tuskegee, Alabama, they had to cross the Mason-Dixon line. As soon as they got to that point, things changed drastically. That was their first exposure, for many of them, to the segregation that existed. Mr. Thorpe, in a conversation with him, had a ticket that was given to him by the government. That ticket was confiscated when he got to the Mason-Dixon line. He was forced to move to the front of the train where all the soot from the coal from the trains was being dumped on the cars immediately behind the engine. The same story for Mr. Johnson. The same story for many of the airmen I spoke to in their move to go to Tuskegee. When they arrived at Tuskegee, most of them decided to stay on base because when they left Tuskegee base to go into town, they faced again discrimination. They were not trusted. They were in fear of their lives. They had things they just did not want to put up with. So they stayed on base for their own protection. So even though they were training to fight for the country, they were afraid to leave the base where they were being trained. And this is the significance of the Tuskegee Airmen, the message that we try and get across, that many things that are faced today are minuscule, and I'm sure you understand that greatest generation encompasses everyone. World War II has been designated by many as the greatest generation in our past because of what they endured during that war. This includes the Tuskegee Airmen. This includes many of people of color who fought in that war as well. Mr. Johnson had 5 brothers. They were all in the war. One of his brothers would send him a letter when he was training that he was on the ground overseas, and the Tuskegee Airmen flew overhead. And he was so proud because he knew who they were, to see them fly overhead. So this was not just a minuscule thing. They knew a job they had to get done. I'm going to play, if you don't mind, I'll put that on. I have a clip from Mr. Johnson, and I think it would be better if you listen to him, his excitement.
I call it the adventure with the Tuskegee Airmen as the second greatest adventure in my life, for several reasons. Because I did what I wanted to do, I did the impossible, okay? The opportunity wasn't there for blacks to fly. They say blacks cannot fly. But the door cracked open, and I walked through, me and others. And the wonderful men that I trained with were wonderful young men, okay? I guess it was because we were all of the same ilk, more or less. We were ambitious. We wanted to do things. We had our pride, okay? From there, I went to Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, okay? And me and a number of other PACs, they call us PACs, pre-aviation cadets. And we got there and we were housed in the building. And I think on D-Day, I got to D-Day. And I was so happy because when I got there and I went down to the flying line, etc., and when I saw those black pilots come down and swoop down and buzz the field and go up and down and make a slow roll or snap roll, etc., I was so excited. I said, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do.
I can still see the excitement on your face.
Okay, it certainly was. I was so proud, and so happy, okay, to be there. And because that's what I wanted for a long period of time. Like I said before, growing up and looking at the skies there when I was a youngster, they wouldn't allow blacks to fly. I knew no matter how many planes I saw flying over military planes, I knew there were no blacks in there. Okay.
That's Mr. Johnson. Believe it or not, when I filmed that, he was 92 years old. And that's indicative of all of those gentlemen. They were excited, and I thought it was important for you to see just how excited he still is about his adventure at Tuskegee. At the age of 92, he's still, a light shines in his eyes, how excited he was to be there. And this is a man who put everything into it. He was still in gun code. You could see the planes flying over the mission field. And he decided at the end of his experience, which is where he wanted to be, that he had had enough. And that took an awful lot to say, I've given it my all. I'm not going to make it into the war. It's time to go back and do something else. He led a lifelong contribution to youth, to the county, to the United States. He went on many lecture tours with us. He spoke to many children in their school who would travel anywhere. He spoke to the 106th Rescue Unit out in West Hampton Beach, encouraging them to continue their job and how important it was. And that was something that all of them did. I had the opportunity to meet a lead bombardier from the B-17s. I had a chance to go with the Tuskegee Airmen on one of the honor flights to Washington. And on that flight was a man who was a bombardier for the B-17s in World War II. In speaking with him, he said, I was a regular bombardier for quite a while. And then the opportunity came for me to be the lead bombardier, which is the one who told everybody else now. And he said he would look out the window and see the red tails, and he felt so safe. So it just carried across. And this is straight from someone who was there. So it's not just hearsay. It's for real. And I would encourage you to do as pass the word. Just do some research, ask to continue their message, which is encourage youth to continue their education and to continue going for their goals, in spite of any obstruction. Things are very hard now, but it can be done. Some of these posters up here are about the Tuskegee Airmen, some of their accomplishments. And we talked about flying prior to World War II. There was a gentleman here that flew for the French. He was known as the Black Swallow of Death. He flew for the French in World War I. Many of the black units fought for the French in World War I because they were not allowed to fight for the United States. That changed in World War II. In essence, because of the Tuskegee Airmen. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
If you have any questions from the audience, we'd be more than happy to field them, if you'd like. Anything you want to clarify or questions you might have? Yes,
I've got
ma'am.
a question. Did they ever fly in the Pacific Theater at all, or just in the Europe?
No, they were, it's a wonderful question. The 477th Bomb Group got their orders just prior to the bombing of Japan to move. They were going to move to the Pacific. One might ask, and I kind of didn't want to bring this up, but if it's okay, Ray, I think this might be a good time to do it. You might say to yourself, how come the 477th Bomb Group never made its appearance in the European theater? Well, this is our government again. Our government said it's okay for a man of color to fight one-on-one with a white man, but a man of color cannot bomb a white population. So, fast forward to Normandy. The 477 Bomb Group was trained in low-level bombing. I'm sure everybody saw Saving Private Ryan, how that Normandy beach, Omaha Beach, was littered with white lives. One can speculate that if the 477th Bomb Group had been allowed to go to Normandy, they would have, and I've been to Normandy. I don't know how many of you folks had the privilege of being there, but I saw those bluffs. And the Navy missed its target, the Army Air Force or U.S. Air Force missed its target. The German defenders simply came out of their holes and threw everything they had at the United States. White soldiers, some black soldiers in there as well, of course. But had the 477th been allowed to go in, it would have been a different story. That B-25 that they were trained on also had an accessory piece of armament, a 75 millimeter recoilless rifle. The shell is like this. And once again, had they been allowed to fly, they would have gone down on the deck, not worried about their own lives, but out there to save white lives. And they would have destroyed the German emplacements. But they were not allowed because our government, at the height of the carnage, still enforced this incredibly bad statement. So, to answer your question, ma'am, it was okay for a man of color to drop bombs on a yellow man. And that's why they were ready to go to Japan. And of course, the atom bomb was dropped. Incredible story, but all true. All true. Yes, ma'am.
When you said that decision came from the highest levels of the government, was it the highest levels of the political side or the military side?
It was both, ma'am. I don't believe there was, aside from Benjamin Davis and probably some high-ranking officers that supported everything he did. And here I can't give you the specifics. I'm only going by, again, my stories and my information is from the folks that lived it. So I can't give you that, but I do believe that there was a forbidden passage somewhere in the higher whatever that you cannot do what I described. I will never know, man. We'll never really know. But the fact of the matter is, the 477th was not deployed to Europe, and they would desperately need it, desperately. They wouldn't allow them to go.
So that was Roosevelt and Truman.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes. Anybody else, any other questions that could answer? Before you leave, oh yes, I'm sorry.
I know you work at the Air Power Museum.
Yes, ma'am.
Are there any replicas of the Tuskegee, or are there any planes still of the Tuskegee Airmen?
Yes.
Possibly in American Air Power? Or
No, yes, thank you so much for that question. The American Air Power Museum, and that's where I first met these wonderful men, is located right off Route 110 in Farmingdale. We have an operational P-40 Warhawk there. We have an operational, all our equipment flies. We have an operational B-25 Mitchell bomber there, and they just received a P-51D Mustang. Up till now, we've had a full-scale replica, but there is a P-51D Mustang there, and I have no idea what, with this terrible COVID situation, what Memorial Day will look like, but traditionally, a B-25, the Yankee Lady, makes her appearance once a year at the airport as well, and you'll see this thing looks like an enormous aircraft, but when you get inside the fuselage, what these men fought, how they fought, and again, I am sure, I'm a Vietnam era soldier myself, but never picked up a weapon, never had to shoot at anybody. But I can only imagine what these men, these white fellas in these aircraft must have felt when they saw these men of color almost wing to wing with them, knowing that they were there to keep them alive. And we talked about the terrible attrition rate before close air support came into being. So it's you can't come up with a more compelling story of brotherhood than that. I think that kind of says it all. I'm sorry you get carried away with these things, but I've lived almost 77 years now, and I have to say that my experience with the Air Power Museum, but more so the experience with the Tuskegee Airmen, has truly been one of the high points of my life. I will never forget these men. And Mr. Burns will give you, anybody who does not have the link to a wonderful program that this wonderful gentleman helped to produce and Ray directed. You're going to hear stories, not only from Mr. Johnson, but stories of today. I was privileged to work with a Tuskegee Airman who actually spoke to the Bloods and the Crips, these two terrible gangs at Rikers Island. And he made such an impact on those people that when there was a major uprising within the cell block, I believe that his words helped to inspire some of those kids to pull the, how shall we say, the naysayers off the prison guard that they were attacking. Just an incredible group of men, and as I say, the women who love them. So I once again thank you, and I thank Ray and this wonderful gentleman and Kelly for allowing me to be here tonight. Thank you so much.
A few of the airmen, and then I'll be quiet. Dabney Montgomery, who was in the ground crew, later became one of the bodyguards for Martin Luther King on the Selma March, and it turned out they both had the same godmother. Floyd Carter became a high-ranking detective in the New York City Police Department. He became a commander of a fighter squadron in the Korean War. So they continued to advance themselves and work for the advancement of everyone. They just didn't come home and, okay, I'm going back to life as it was. They came back to survive, get their education, most of them went back to school. The original airmen were from college. They picked only the best for the first class. They were either college in college or had graduated from college. They wanted only the best for that first class of 13. And then subsequently, they screened very highly, very much those who were in pilot school for training. So they just were not, they were very picky, because they knew they had to succeed. They had no choice. There was a bigger thing at risk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.